Hey kids, today we're going to learn about Joseph Stalin. So yeah, if you recall when we were looking at the rise of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, right? Lenin is the guy who establishes the first communist nation in the world, right? With the October or the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. We see Russia turn to communism, turn towards Marxism. And then Lenin rules the nation of Russia, which then, of course, becomes the USSR in 1922, up until 1924. In 1924, he dies, and then we get this guy, this beauty right here. So Joseph Stalin rules the Soviet Union from 1924 to 1953. So he had power for 29 years, nearly 3 decades. And like any good social lesson, right, we should be starting with a meme. Now here's a question. Why would Obama be compared with Joseph Stalin? Why would Stalin be writing Obama saying, keep up the good work? What made Obama a socialist or a communist? And I think most people would suggest that it was because of the Obamacare, right? The Affordable Care Act, as it's usually known. Because of that, a lot of Americans see Obama, not a lot, some Americans see Obama as some sort of commie who's trying to control them. Okay, so let's move forward. All right, so in this slide, if there's one thing about Joseph Stalin, we consider him to be a monster, which he was, right? In the previous module, it spoke about how the death toll of Stalin's rule for the 29 years was between 20 to 60 million people killed, right? They called them unnatural deaths. And then you see an image like this on the screen where you see young Joseph Stalin here on the left, looking dapper, looking good. And then, of course, we have Patrick Dempsey on Grey's Anatomy, known as McDreamy, right? I had to have some students tell me that. I know him as the guy from Can't Buy Me Love, which was a movie in the 1980s, or maybe it was the early 90s. You've maybe watched it in your English classes. But anyways, young Stalin, he was a dashing young man. And I mean, look at the flow. Look at that flow on the top of his head. Impressive. Okay, anyways, let's keep moving forward. So, what did Stalin want to achieve with his Soviet Union? And was he successful? Well, ultimately, we'll have a look at that as we go through the 2 parts of the PowerPoint. Now, on this particular slide, we have an intro video. That video was in the module previous to this one. And please make sure you check that video out. It does a nice little introductory session for you on sort of what Stalin was trying to achieve and what his goals were and the toll of his legacy. So check that video out. Now, it says one of his goals was to modernize the Soviet society and the Soviet economy. The Soviet Union, when Stalin took over in 1924, was still largely a non-industrialized country. And Stalin, because of the intervention by the West in the Russian Civil War, if you recall that from when we looked at Lenin, the West got involved in the Russian Civil War. Almost immediately after the Russian Revolution, we have the Russian Civil War happening. So from 1917 to 1922, various Western forces like the United States, Great Britain, France, and others got involved in the formative civil war of Russia. So Stalin and many other higher-ups in the Bolshevik Party believed that the West was coming for them. And the only way that we can defend ourselves against the capitalist West is if we are modern. If we are a backwards, non-industrialized country, they will crush us. So he believed that war against the West at some point was inevitable, so we must be strong. And that kind of brings us into the next point here about ensuring the national security of the Soviet Union. You can only do that should you have a strong military. And we will see under the iron fist of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Red Army becomes one of the largest militaries the world has ever seen. We were scared of them legitimately because of the sheer size of it. Now, in order to continue with the security of the nation of the Soviet Union, Stalin and Trotsky had a different view on how this was going to happen. If you remember, just as a little side piece here, Leon Trotsky, he was Lenin's trusted confidant. He was the guy that Lenin actually wanted to gain control of the Soviet Union once Lenin passed away. Lenin said so in his testament, right? And that was in the Lenin PowerPoint that you should have looked at. With Lenin's testament, what we saw here, guys, was the beginning of sort of a rift, a schism, a split between people who supported Stalin in one hand and people who supported Trotsky in the other. Both wanted to spread communism throughout the world, but they both had a different view of it. Remember, guys, if you're a true Marxist, you believe that communism will be the salvation of the world's proletariat. So how are we going to do this? So Stalin's view on how to do this was called socialism in one country. Socialism in one country basically works like this. Do it well here, do it well in the Soviet Union, and it will become utopia. And once the rest of the world sees this utopia, then they will demand from their governments the imposition or the use of communism as their ideological system. For Trotsky, he believed in something called permanent revolution. What Trotsky wanted to do was basically inspire revolutions across the world by actively getting involved in those nations' political systems, right? Like actually like agitate and inspire communists to try to overthrow governments and things like that, just like what the Bolsheviks did in Russia, right, in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. So two very different means in order to achieve the same goal, which was the worldwide imposition of communism. And then lastly, on the slide, it mentions that Stalin wants to maintain his leadership at all cost. And we will see that in the second part of the Stalin lesson that we're going to go through here, where basically he engaged in these things called the purges, right? And we'll talk about why and who were his targets of his purges. All right, now, Comrade Stalin as revolutionary. So guys, in Soviet history, Stalin was taught, children in the Soviet Union learned about Joseph Stalin as, this great individual who was, all the benefits, all the great things going on in the nation of the Soviet Union was because of Joseph Stalin. So they were heavily, heavily indoctrinated in this country. Now, growing up, Stalin was a devout Marxist. He read the Communist Manifesto, and he also read the writings of one Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin in the early 1900s, I think around 1902, he writes this political pamphlet called What is to be Done? Right? This right here, What is to be Done? And basically, what this pamphlet is Lenin's advocation for the need for revolution in Russia. How are we going to fix the poor, oppressed proletariat? How are we going to fix this exploitative situation going on here? Now, once Stalin joins the Bolshevik Party, and this party forms in the early 1910s, him and Lenin had a turbulent relationship. They had many disagreements. In the early days of the Bolshevik Party, Stalin was a low-level thug. To demonstrate his loyalty and his willingness to achieve the revolution, he engaged in things like robbing of banks and random acts of violence. Like, why rob banks? Like, why did he do that? Well, the party needed money. Right, the party needed money to finance party activities. Stalin, as a loyal soldier, right, as a loyal Bolshevik, would go and engage in the robbing of banks, right? And again, it mentions acts of violence there as well. Right, Stalin was no stranger to the use of violence. And then in 1922, after the revolution is successful, he's appointed general secretary of the Bolshevik Party. And while this position isn't super high up in the rank and file of the Bolshevik Party, what it does is it allows him to appoint small Bolshevik leaders in like local communities that created a circle of loyalty around him. And this ultimately is bad for Leon Trotsky. Once Lenin becomes ill, right, 1923, 1924, we have Trotsky and Stalin kind of like vying for position, right, to become the leader of the Bolsheviks. And because of the fact that Stalin was able to appoint people who would be loyal to him, right? I don't know if you guys have ever heard the expression before, don't bite the hand that feeds you. Well, Stalin was the hand that was feeding many individuals in the Bolshevik Party. So when it came time to express loyalty for either Stalin or Trotsky, what happened is many of those, local Bolshevik leaders gave their loyalty to Stalin. So despite Lenin's warnings that Stalin couldn't be trusted in his, I want to say manifesto, in his testament, right? In his testament, this is how Stalin ultimately grabbed power. And speaking of Lenin's testament, in 1924, after securing his power, Lenin's testament is actually banned, right? Lenin's testament becomes subjected to censorship, which is another very effective technique of dictatorships, right? We looked at those before. Censorship, the controlling of information, is very important in totalitarian states. If you control what people read, if you control what people consume as far as information, you control what they think. And that ultimately is a very powerful thing to have. All right, so in this image, we can see Joseph Stalin. Note the mustache, right? Like any good Marxist, the facial hair is starting to grow. By the way, I'm not a Marxist. Yeah, guys, you can see in this particular image here, we see one of the many arrests of one Joseph Stalin. So if you just go to the Google machine and you type in, Stalin arrests, you can check out all the times that he was arrested and for what activities he was arrested for. All right. Now, one central feature of Stalin's reign in the Soviet Union was the technique of dictatorships known as propaganda, right? And guys, Stalin was a master of propaganda. So in this image here, we have a piece of propaganda produced once Stalin was in power that tries to demonstrate how Lenin on the left, right? That's Vlad Lenin, and then Stalin on the right, how him and Lenin were in fact friends, right? They were associates, but again, we know the relationship that Lenin had with Stalin. It was turbulent, right? There was friction there at times, and very clearly at the end, Lenin said, do not let Stalin get power. Yet, that's still what happens. This next image here, I love how you always have Lenin in the background, right? Lenin in the background, as if Stalin is the guy who's going to be leading the continuance or the continuation of the revolution, right? So we have this image here of Stalin. You know, you got the people behind him, right? They're following him. He is simply continuing on with the Leninist revolution. Again, more images of Lenin and Stalin. Again, forward towards utopia we go. This one is great. I love this one. So we have Marx, obviously, right there. We have Frederick Engels right here. We have Lenin right here. And then we have Joseph Stalin right here. When I see this image, I think to myself, these are sort of the successors of the Bolshevik or the communist Marxist revolution in the world. All right, so Stalin's main policies from 1928 to 1953. So this particular presentation, this video, is only going to cover the 5-year plans and collectivization of agriculture. And then on the next video, we'll look at Holodomor, right? The famine in Ukraine from 1932 to 1933. We'll also talk about the impact on different groups in the Soviet Union. We'll look at the mass system of indoctrination. We'll talk about the purges and the gulags, and then we'll look at how Stalin leads the Soviet Union in what is called the Great Patriotic War. That's what the Soviets call it. We, of course, call it World War II. All right, so the 5-year plans. So guys, I mentioned earlier that the Soviet Union in the early 1900s was a non-industrialized, basically very agricultural, peasant-driven economy. And Stalin again recognized that they need to catch up to the West, right? Like they need to modernize. And how are we going to do it? Well, being a centrally planned economy, right? That's what we often call a communist economy. Being a centrally planned economy, what the Bolsheviks came up with was a series of what are known as 5-year plans. Now notice that is plural, right? It's not plan, it's plans. So there's many of them, right? There's many of them. Now the goal, as mentioned, was to modernize the Soviet Union and catch them up to the rest of the world's powers industrially. Guys, when I think 5-year plans, I think this is basically Russia's, or the Soviet Union, sorry, this is their industrial revolution, right? This is them becoming a modern state. Now, these plans were developed by a state planning commission known as Gosplan, and you can see here all the different things that were focused on by the 5-year plans. And when you look at the things that were the focus of the 5-year plans, developing the vast coal resources of the Soviet Union, building of or the creation of or the removal of iron from the earth in order to produce steel, right? The use of its vast oil and hydroelectric resources. So guys, you can see basically these are the building blocks of a modern industrial economy, right? And then we see the continuance of, right, natural resources being sort of a very important part of the 5-year plans. And then from 33 to 37 in the second 5-year plan, we see now that the country is becoming industrialized, now we can actually start manufacturing consumer goods. So during the 5-year plans, during the second one, this is where the motor car, right, the automobile, is introduced to the average Soviet citizen. So that's kind of cool, although they produce terrible cars. And then in the third 5-year plan, same thing, keep it going, right? Natural resources, consumer goods. And then in 1941, with the Nazis threatening invasion of the Soviet Union, we see the massive Soviet industrial complex change to armament, right? Change to armament against the Nazis, the building of tanks, planes, all these different things. And then there was a fourth and a fifth 5-year plan as well. And basically they were all about rebuilding the Soviet Union because a good part of it was destroyed by the Nazis as the Nazis pushed eastward in order to gain living space, or Lebensraum as they call it. All right, so in this image, we can see the factories of the 5-year plans. Those are tractors or bulldozers, right? Like these 5-year plan projects. I mean, if you want to build a modern economy, you need to have, right, the machinery in which to do it. So where once there was just barren landscape, what we saw in the Soviet Union was the building of factories, the building of plants, things like that, in order to create the machinery needed to help modernize the economy. This image here is an image from an old National Geographic magazine, and it's an image of an iron smelting plant, right? If you want to produce steel, you need iron, and that, of course, you need a foundry for all that kind of stuff. So that's what's going on here. And this image here is kind of cool. So we're talking the 1930s. In most Western nations, women were still largely relegated to the domestic sphere, the home, right? The place of women in most Western countries in the 1930s was still in the home, right? They were to be the child rearers. They were to be the people in charge of, cooking, cleaning, all those kinds of things as the man went out and made the money. But in the Soviet Union, we actually saw women inside of the 5-year plan factories, which was kind of cool. I mean, it speaks to the egalitarian nature of what the Soviets were trying to achieve. Now, some more propaganda here. So I love these. So these are Soviet propaganda posters regarding the 5-year plans. We'll look at the one in the top left-hand side here. In this image, we have, the mighty Soviets. You can see the Soviet hammer, right? The hammer and the sickle, right? Very important imagery to communism, to the Soviet Union. You can see the mighty Soviet worker, right, working in the iron smelting plants of the 5-year plans. The mighty hammer of the Soviet worker is striking that steel, right, and helping build the economy. In the top right, we have, I love this one. So this individual with the top hat here, that would be a capitalist. And you can see the mighty hand of the Soviet worker holding a book, right, about the first 5-year plan, right? First plan begins in 1928. And he's snickering at the ambitiousness of the 5-year plan. Then in the second part of the image below it, we see all of a sudden, bang, a factory, right? Just boom, there it is. And the capitalist bourgeois individual is kind of like, right? Like really upset because, communism's winning. And then in the bottom image here, we have a number of individuals trying to stop the industrialization. Quite often, guys, a train, right, a locomotive is a symbol of industrialization, and you can see all these individuals trying to stop the train from rolling down the tracks, from the 5-year plans from being successful. But are you going to stop a train while it's at speed? Nah, you're not going to, right? All right, so this is a quote from Joseph Stalin. On this slide here, ladies and gentlemen, we have a link that I would suggest you click on. So guys, in 1931, in front of the high-ranking members of the Bolshevik Party, Stalin gives a speech basically justifying why the 5-year plans had to happen. I'm not going to read it all for you because no doubt you can read, but the part that's in yellow is the important part. Stalin says in this speech, we must make up this gap in 10 years. Either we do this or they crush us. So he's basically saying if we don't catch up to the West when the West comes from or for us, we will be beaten and we will be defeated. So in this image here, you can see the happy recipients of all the blessings that come with the 5-year plans, right? And I'm always amazed by how great their teeth were. They must have had fantastic dental care in the Soviet Union. And look, they have modern technology like record players. They have light bulbs. So this is now an electrified society. They have electricity. Quite cool. Now, in this image here, we have basically the output of important resources or materials during the 5-year plans. And what I want you guys to notice is how the amount of procurement of all these different resources from 1937 to 1945 to 1950 does indeed go up. It goes up dramatically. Did the 5-year plans work? The answer is absolutely. They absolutely made Russia into an industrial and military superpower. So in this image here, guys, you can see that coal output from 1937 until 1950 basically doubled. The amount of oil produced basically went up by 1.5 times, and then the amount of steel from 1937 to 1950 basically doubled as well. So with the 5-year planners, right, that body called Gauss plan, with them being in control of who goes where, who does what, it did in fact create a rather sizable economy. In fact, when the 5-year plans were happening, America and the rest of the world was going through the Great Depression. Yet in the Soviet Union, they were crying out for workers, which is pretty interesting, right? So yeah, so it was very, very successful. And again, at the bottom of this particular slide, there is a piece of Soviet propaganda surrounding or about the 5-year plans that you should check out. They built, or they created some beautiful propaganda. In this piece of propaganda, you will see the angry capitalist who just, they're so mad at the success of the 5-year plans. All right, now, in order to entice, to motivate individuals in the 5-year plan projects, the Soviet government, I would argue, created a hero for the people. And this hero's name was Alexei Stakhanov. He's known in the Soviet Union as the Great Stakhanov. Now, who was he? He was a coal miner. What did he do? In one shift, he mined 102 tons of coal in less than 6 hours, which was 14 times his daily quota. This man became the face of the Soviet work ethic, or at least the work ethic that the Soviet government wanted the people to have. Now, this individual was rewarded. He got cars. He became basically a celebrity in the Soviet Union, which is kind of cool. So he became a folk hero, and statues of Alexei Stakhanov went up all around the Soviet Union. If you just Google Alexei Stakhanov, you can see his name spelt there on the slide. Alexei Stakhanov statues, you will literally see statues that were in different Soviet towns with him holding his mighty coal miner pickaxe. And the people, like, they adored him. So the Soviet government from this created something known as the Stakhanovite movement. And basically, if you were a go-getter, you could become a member of the Stakhanovite movement, and you would be rewarded for it. Now, why did they create this movement? To encourage worker productivity. Now, guys, when we talked about techniques of dictatorships, right, I would consider Alexei Stakhanov to be a tool of propaganda, right? He was a tool of propaganda. Whether he mined 102 tons of coal in 6 hours, that doesn't matter. What matters is how he was used by the Soviet government. And that was basically, they created this movement, right, to reward the people. On the next slide, right, inside the different factories of the 5-year plans, right, you would have the photos of individuals going into these circles if they were being awarded to the Order of the Stakhanovites, and you would get to go to fancy dinners, right? You would be celebrated. This is actually kind of interesting, because when you think about Western society, when you think about like Canada or the US, Great Britain, who do we idolize? Who do we put up on pedestals? And the answer is athletes and movie stars and musicians. But here in the Soviet Union, regular people, right, just industrial workers were the ones who were being celebrated, and maybe that says something about, our lack of priority here in Western society. I mean, we have doctors, nurses, engineers who do great things for society, maybe even teachers, and, they're not celebrated. But in the Soviet Union, right, we had this group of celebrated workers who were honored, which is kind of cool. Now, the second major thing that Stalin wanted to do was what is known as the collectivization of farms, sometimes called the collectivization of agriculture. Now, collectivization, what happened? What happened here, guys, is the state basically took all private plots and made them into state-run plots. So the whole point of collectivization was to boost agricultural output, to have the farming efficiency of the Soviet Union increase dramatically. So during the collectivization of agriculture, tractors and other modern farming equipment were introduced to the Soviet Union. And did it work? Absolutely, right? If its goal was to boost agricultural production, it indeed did. Now, there's one group in particular that we need to talk about when we talk about collectivization of farms, and that was a group known as the kulaks. We mentioned the kulaks before. The kulaks are the eternal scapegoat of the Soviet Union. The word kulak, if you click this video down here, right, you'll see a video about it, and I encourage you to do so. The word kulak means capitalist. Or the context in which it's used here is it means capitalist. And basically these kulaks resisted collectivization. They didn't want to give up their private farm plots and have the state run them and create these giant collective farms. And in the end, guys, what happened to the kulaks was they were liquidated. And the word liquidate means to get rid of, right? When you think about like stores like Liquidation World, that's where businesses who can't sell stock, they sell it to Liquidation World and then they get rid of it, right? Like they just get rid of it cheap and quick. So what Stalin wanted to do was launch a class war against the kulaks, and they actually had groups of people called dekulakizators who engaged in dekulakization, basically getting rid of these capitalists. And from 1932 to 1933, we see this dekulakization play out in the famine in Ukraine that we today call Holodomor. So what happened, guys, is with the collectivization of farms, individual farms became giant state-run plots. And every morning, the people would have their meetings with their collective farm leaders, and they would be given propaganda. They would be given their goals for the day, their quotas. And as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, right, this is some propaganda surrounding the collectivization of farms in the Soviet Union. This really idealizes it, as does this piece of propaganda right here, this video that, again, I encourage you to check these videos out. They're trying to paint a rosy picture of what's going on here in the Soviet Union. The reality of the collective farms is they were brutal. If you didn't meet your quotas, you could be beaten, you could be starved, you could be tortured, you could be shot. So the state's trying to present it as something that is awesome, right? As something that everyone buys into, and we're all going to work hard and achieve these goals. But in fact, guys, the life on the on the collective farms was harsh and brutal. All right, so that wraps up our first video about the 5-year plans, and yeah, we will continue on looking at the next part of our video here. So we'll check you guys later. Peace. Have a good day.